I spent 12 years building my family business, but Nephew took it all from me. Hello, read it. Loyalty. That's what my parents always said was the most important thing in life. Loyalty to your family, loyalty to the people who believe in you, loyalty to the legacy you leave behind. For 35 years, I lived by that principle. I poured my blood, sweat, and tears into our family's bakery business because I believed in what we were building together. But now, after everything I've done, I've come to a bitter realization. Loyalty is a two-way street, and not everyone drives on both sides. My name is Alex, and I'm the eldest son in what you'd probably call a typical hardworking, middle-class family. My parents, Dan and Teresa, started the bakery before I was born, back when they were newlyweds with nothing but a little savings, a lot of ambition, and a passion for baking. They opened their first shop in a quiet corner of town, and it quickly became the kind of place where everyone knew your name. When I was a kid, that bakery was my second home. I can still remember the smell of fresh bread wafting through the house, the early mornings when my dad would load trays of dough into the oven before the sun rose, the sound of my mom chatting with customers as she handed out cookies to kids. To me, it wasn't just a business. It was the heart of our family. As I got older, I began to understand how much work went into running the place. My parents never had weekends off. Vacations were unheard of. Every penny they made went right back into the bakery, and even then, there were plenty of nights when they sat at the kitchen table, heads in their hands, wondering how they were going to pay the bills. By the time I finished high school, I knew I wanted to help them. I wasn't a starry-eyed kid with big dreams of becoming a CEO or traveling the world. I just wanted to make life easier for my parents. So, I applied to the local university's business program, figuring I could learn what I needed to help modernize the bakery and make it more profitable. I worked part-time at the bakery throughout college, juggling classes and shifts. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like I was doing something important. By the time I graduated, I'd already started implementing small changes, tracking sales trends, introducing seasonal promotions, even convincing my parents to try posting on social media, which they thought was ridiculous at first. When I finished my degree, I had a choice to make. A few companies had offered me entry-level positions. Nothing glamorous, but enough to start building a career. My friends were all moving to bigger cities, chasing jobs in tech and finance, living the kind of lives you see in Instagram posts. Part of me wanted that too. I wanted to be someone, to have a life that wasn't defined by the smell of yeast and powdered sugar. But then I looked at my parents. My dad's hands were permanently calloused from years of kneading dough. My mom had lines on her face that hadn't been there a decade ago, the kind that come from worry, not age. The bakery was their life, but it was also their burden. I couldn't leave them to carry it alone. So, I stayed. At first, it felt like the right decision. The bakery was struggling when I stepped in full-time, barely breaking even after years of stagnant sales and mounting competition. My parents were set in their ways, resistant to change, but I convinced them to let me try things my way. The first year was brutal. I worked 14-hour days, learning every aspect of the business inside and out. I overhauled the menu, focusing on fresh, high-quality ingredients. I updated the branding, designed a sleek new logo, and launched a website. I even set up an Instagram page, posting mouth-watering photos of our pastries and behind-the-scenes videos that gave customers a glimpse into our process. Slowly but surely, things began to change. Sales started climbing. Our customer base grew. People were talking about us, sharing our posts, and coming back week after week. By the second year, we paid off most of the debts that had been hanging over my parents' heads. By the fifth year, we were opening a second location. By the 10th year, we were a chain of 10 bakeries spread across the city, each one thriving. My parents were thrilled. "You've saved this business," they'd say. "We're so proud of you." And for a while, that was enough. But looking back, I realized now that something was missing. No matter how much I did, no matter how many successes we had, it never felt like the business was truly mine. My parents still treated it as their baby, the thing they'd built with their own hands. And in a way, it was. But I'd poured more than a decade of my life into this business. I'd taken it from the edge of failure and turned it into something they could never have imagined. I thought that counted for something. Then Ethan entered the picture. Ethan is my nephew, the oldest son of my younger brother, Chris. Where I was always the steady, dependable one, Ethan was the golden boy, the kid who could do no wrong. He was smart, charming, and full of ambition. My parents adored him, and it was easy to see why. He had a way of making people believe he was destined for greatness. When Ethan started college, he chose business as his major, which my parents took as a sign that he was following in my footsteps. "He's just like you," my mom would say, her face lighting up with pride. At first, I didn't mind. I liked Ethan, and I was happy to see him taking an interest in the business. During his summer breaks, Ethan interned at the bakery, working under me. I taught him everything I could, from inventory management to marketing strategies. He was eager to learn, though I couldn't help but notice that he seemed more interested in the big-picture stuff than the day-to-day grind. He liked coming up with ideas, but when it came to executing them, his enthusiasm tended to fizzle out. Still, I figured he was young. He'd learn. But as the years went by, I started to notice a shift. Ethan wasn't just the eager intern anymore. He was becoming a fixture. My parents started inviting him to meetings, asking for his input on decisions that didn't concern him. They praised his ideas, even when they were impractical or downright bad, and seemed to hang on his every word. I told myself it didn't matter. At the end of the day, I was the one running the business. Ethan might have their attention now, but I had something more important: results. At least, that's what I thought. Ethan's involvement in the bakery evolved slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a creeping tide. At first, his presence seemed harmless. He started shadowing meetings, sitting quietly at the table while my parents explained the nuances of the business. His role, initially positioned as an observer, soon grew. My parents began asking for his input, treating his opinions as if they carried weight equal to mine, or sometimes more. It felt surreal to see them light up at his every suggestion, even when his ideas bordered on naive. He had a confidence I couldn't fault him for. After all, he just graduated from business school and carried himself as though he had all the answers. What I couldn't ignore was the way my parents seemed to cling to his words, as if years of experience and the steady growth of the bakery under my leadership suddenly mattered less. The change was subtle at first. Ethan's influence crept into small decisions, marketing ideas, social media strategies, but it wasn't long before his fingerprints began to touch more critical aspects of the business. My parents framed it as innovation, a fresh approach for a business poised to attract younger generations. But to me, it felt like the beginning of a shift in power. One particular incident cemented that realization. For months, I had been preparing to launch a new product line centered around artisanal bread. It was a project that had taken months of work, countless meetings with local suppliers, and a significant amount of market research. The concept was built on authenticity, emphasizing locally sourced ingredients and a rustic, handmade appeal. Everything was ready: the recipes, the branding, the partnerships. Then Ethan got involved. Without consulting me, he proposed a redesign of the packaging, suggesting a sleek, minimalist look that stripped away the identity of the product. It was the exact opposite of what I had envisioned: cold and generic, lacking the warmth and character that defined the brand. My parents approved the change without hesitation, brushing aside my concerns. They called it progress, an evolution of the business's image. That moment felt like a crack in the foundation I had spent years building. As the months went on, the cracks widened. Ethan's involvement deepened, his responsibilities expanding into areas I had carefully managed for over a decade. My parents began deferring to him on decisions they used to discuss with me, often without even informing me of the changes until after they were made. What had once felt like a partnership now felt like a quiet takeover. The signs of what was coming were everywhere, but I refused to see them clearly. My parents began speaking about Ethan in ways that left little room for doubt. They celebrated his ideas, praised his potential, and spoke of his vision for the future of the business. Their language shifted subtly but unmistakably, framing him as the heir apparent while my role became increasingly diminished. It all came to a head during a family meeting, one of the regular gatherings my parents held to update everyone on the business. These meetings were usually routine, filled with updates on sales figures, expansion plans, and long-term goals. But this one was different. From the moment I walked into the office, I could feel the weight of something unspoken hanging in the air. Ethan sat beside my parents at the head of the table, a position that had always been reserved for family leadership. His confidence was unmistakable, his posture radiating authority. My parents began the meeting with a speech about the future of the business, emphasizing the importance of preparing for the next phase of growth. The tone was formal, almost rehearsed, and it became increasingly clear that they weren't just making small announcements. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined a new leadership structure for the company. Ethan, they explained, would be stepping into a larger role, one that would allow him to shape the company's direction and position it for the next generation. The words they used were carefully chosen, framed as a logical evolution of the business. But the message was clear. Ethan was being groomed to take over. As the rest of the family applauded, I sat in stunned silence. It wasn't just the announcement that stung. It was the way it had been presented, as though it was an inevitability, something everyone had already accepted except for me. Ethan's expression was triumphant but restrained, a small, knowing smile that seemed to say he had expected this all along. The weight of what had just happened didn't fully sink in until later. For 12 years, I had dedicated my life to building this business. I had poured everything into it, my time, my energy, my identity. And now, without so much as a real discussion, it felt like I was being pushed aside, my contributions reduced to a footnote in the family's narrative. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a shift in leadership. It was a rewriting of history. My parents, who had once leaned on me for everything, now seemed to view me as a placeholder, someone who had kept the seat warm for the real heir to take over. And Ethan? He was more than happy to step into the role, carrying himself as though it had been his all along. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying the events of the meeting over and over again, searching for signs I might have missed, wondering if there had ever been a moment when I could have stopped this from happening. But no matter how many times I went over it, the outcome was always the same. For the first time in my life, I felt like an outsider in my own family. The days after the meeting felt like walking through a fog. My mind replayed everything on a loop, the way my parents had framed their announcements so carefully, the way Ethan had sat at the head of the table like he already owned it. I thought about how the applause had felt deafening in that moment, even though it wasn't meant for me. What stung the most wasn't just that they had made this decision without me. It was the way they had made it seem inevitable, as if I had simply been filling a gap until Ethan was ready to take over. It wasn't a sudden betrayal. It had been creeping in for months, maybe even years, and I had ignored all the signs. I buried myself in work, telling myself that I still had a place here, that there was still a role for me even if I wasn't the one steering the ship. But it was impossible to ignore the shift in dynamics. Meetings that had once been collaborative were now focused on Ethan's ideas. Decisions I used to make without question now required his input, or worse, his approval. The changes weren't just happening at the leadership level. Employees who had worked with me for years started treating me differently, their loyalty shifting as they realized who my parents now favored. Conversations would quiet when I entered a room, and I could sense the unspoken question hanging in the air. How long will Alex really be here? Ethan, of course, seemed to thrive in his new role. He approached every situation with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having faced real failure. He made big, sweeping changes, focusing on flashy initiatives that looked good on the surface but often ignored the nuances of what made the business successful. I watched as he rolled out a marketing campaign that drained a significant portion of the budget but failed to bring in the expected returns. When I brought up my concerns to my parents, they dismissed them, chalking up the loss to growing pains. There were moments when I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself that this was just a phase, that my parents would eventually realize the value I brought to the company. But deep down, I knew the truth. They had already made their decision. The breaking point came a few months later. One of our oldest employees, Clara, had been with the bakery since my parents opened the first location. She was more than just a staff member. She was like family. Clara had helped train me when I first started working there, and she had been a constant presence through all the highs and lows. Ethan, in his quest to streamline operations, decided that Clara's role was no longer necessary. He argued that her job could be automated, that we could save money by eliminating her position. My parents, eager to support his vision, agreed without hesitation. When I found out, I felt a wave of anger so intense it took everything I had not to storm into their office and demand an explanation. Clara didn't deserve this. She had been loyal to my parents through years of struggle, and now they were casting her aside like she was expendable. I tried to fight for her, explaining how much she contributed to the team, how her institutional knowledge was invaluable. But it was like talking to a brick wall. My parents insisted it was the right decision, that Ethan was simply making tough choices for the greater good. Watching Clara pack up her things and leave was one of the hardest moments I've ever experienced. She didn't blame me. If anything, she went out of her way to thank me for everything I had done for her over the years. But her words only made the pain worse, because I knew I had failed her. That night, as I sat alone in my office, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit to myself. This wasn't just about the business anymore. It wasn't even about Ethan. It was about my parents, the people who had raised me, who I had spent my entire life trying to support. They had chosen him over me, and no amount of hard work or dedication was going to change that. For the first time in my life, I started to wonder if I belonged here at all. Over the next few weeks, I began to pull back. I stopped attending some of the meetings, leaving Ethan to handle them on his own. I delegated more of my responsibilities, giving myself time to reflect on what I really wanted. At first, my absence went unnoticed, but it didn't take long for the questions to start. Ethan, ever the opportunist, took advantage of my withdrawal. He framed it as a lack of commitment on my part, subtly positioning himself as the one who was truly invested in the business. My parents, of course, ate it up. They began leaning on him even more, further cementing his position as the future of the company. I started spending more time away from the bakery, finding excuses to work from home or visit our suppliers instead of sitting in the office. It gave me space to think, but it also highlighted just how much I had lost. The business that had once felt like an extension of myself now felt foreign, as if I were an outsider looking in. The final blow came when I overheard a conversation between my parents and Ethan during one of their private meetings. They were discussing the long-term vision for the company, and my name wasn't mentioned once. It was as if I had already been written out of the story, my contributions erased in favor of Ethan's grand plans. Hearing their words felt like a punch to the gut. I had spent 12 years building this business, sacrificing my time, my relationships, and my personal ambitions to ensure its success. And now, it was being handed over to someone who had only just begun to understand what it meant to run a company. As I walked out of the office that day, I realized I couldn't keep doing this. Staying meant watching everything I had built be reshaped by someone who didn't understand the foundation it was built on. It meant continuing to fight a battle I had already lost. I didn't know what my next step would be, but one thing was clear. My time here was coming to an end. Stepping away from the business was harder than I thought it would be. For 12 years, the bakery had been my life. Every success, every challenge, every late night spent poring over budgets or testing new recipes. It had all felt like a reflection of me. Now, as I pulled back further with each passing day, I started to feel the weight of everything I was leaving behind. It wasn't just the bakery itself. It was the people. For years, I had been the person my employees turned to when something went wrong. I was the one who celebrated their successes, who listened to their concerns, who fought to make sure they felt valued. But as I began to withdraw, I noticed how quickly they adjusted to Ethan's growing presence. At first, I told myself they were just being polite. Ethan was in charge now, at least unofficially, and they didn't want to upset the new order. But over time, I realized it wasn't just about him. It was about me. My absence created a vacuum, and Ethan was more than happy to fill it. Employees who had once confided in me now seemed hesitant to speak up. Decisions I used to make without hesitation were now being routed through Ethan. It was as if my presence had become an afterthought, a relic of a time they had already moved past. The worst part, though, was watching my parents. For years, I had been the one they relied on, the one they trusted to keep the business afloat. Now, they barely seemed to notice I was pulling away. If they did, they didn't say anything. Instead, they threw themselves into Ethan's vision for the company, treating him as though he were the savior they had been waiting for all along. It was hard not to feel like a ghost, drifting through the halls of a place that had once felt like home. The turning point came a few weeks later. I had been spending most of my time at one of our supplier facilities, trying to avoid the main office as much as possible. One afternoon, I received a call from one of my closest friends, someone who had been with the bakery almost as long as I had. She sounded uncomfortable, hesitant, as if she didn't want to be the one to deliver bad news. Apparently, there had been a meeting, a big one. Ethan had called it, inviting key employees and stakeholders to discuss the company's future strategy. I hadn't been invited. The details of the meeting were vague, but the message was clear. Ethan was now the one leading the charge. He had presented a series of ambitious plans for expansion, complete with flashy presentations and promises of exponential growth. My parents had been in full support, nodding along as he outlined his vision. Hearing about it secondhand was like a gut punch. This was the kind of meeting I would have led just a year ago, the kind of discussion where my voice would have been the loudest in the room. Now, I wasn't even considered relevant enough to be there. I drove home that evening feeling a mix of anger and despair. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about my place in the family, in a legacy I had spent over a decade helping to build. My parents had made their choice, and it was clear that I wasn't part of the picture anymore. The distance between us grew rapidly after that. Family dinners, once a source of comfort and connection, became tense and awkward. My parents spoke endlessly about the bakery, about Ethan's innovative ideas and his plans for the future. They barely asked about me or what I was working on. It was as if I had faded into the background, a supporting character in a story that used to revolve around me. Ethan, of course, thrived in the spotlight. He carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance, relishing every opportunity to remind me, and everyone else, of his new role. I tried to stay out of his way, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. One day, while I was visiting one of the bakery locations to check on a project I had started months earlier, I noticed something that sent a chill through me. The posters advertising the artisanal bread line, the one I had spent so much time developing, had been replaced. In their place were glossy images of new products Ethan had introduced, trendy items that bore no resemblance to the heart and soul of what our bakery had always been. The employees I spoke to seemed cautious, their words carefully chosen as they explained the changes. They told me Ethan had decided to phase out some of the less profitable products, focusing instead on items that aligned with his vision. When I asked why no one had told me about these changes, they shifted uncomfortably and avoided eye contact. That was the moment I realized just how far I had fallen. This wasn't my business anymore. It wasn't even my parents' business. It was Ethan's. For weeks, I wrestled with the decision of what to do next. Part of me wanted to fight back, to demand a seat at the table and remind everyone of what I had done for this company. But another part of me knew it was a losing battle. My parents had already made their decision, and nothing I said or did was going to change their minds. The thought of leaving was unbearable, but staying felt even worse. Every day I spent in that office was a reminder of what I had lost, of the years I had devoted to something that no longer felt like mine. I began to make quiet preparations, reaching out to contacts I had built over the years, exploring options I had never allowed myself to consider before. It felt like a betrayal to even think about leaving, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of emptiness inside me. The bakery had been my life for so long that I didn't know who I was without it. But now, for the first time, I was starting to wonder if it was time to find out. The decision to leave wasn't one I made overnight. It came slowly, in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to put together. For weeks, I carried the weight of it with me everywhere I went, trying to reconcile the life I had built with the reality of what it had become. I spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, playing out every scenario in my head. What if I stayed? What if I fought harder? What if I could somehow fix what felt so irreparably broken? But the answer was always the same. I couldn't fix it. The bakery was no longer the place I had poured myself into for 12 years. It had changed, molded itself around Ethan's vision, a vision my parents had fully embraced. Staying would mean resigning myself to a diminished role, watching from the sidelines as my life's work was reshaped by someone who didn't understand its foundation. It would mean swallowing my pride and sacrificing my own happiness to maintain a peace that no longer felt worth keeping. When I finally told my parents I was leaving, their reaction surprised me. They didn't fight me on it. They didn't try to convince me to stay or tell me I was making a mistake. They simply nodded, their expressions a mix of sadness and resignation, as if they had been expecting this all along. I had imagined a dozen different ways the conversation might go. Maybe they'd realize how much I had sacrificed for the bakery, how much I had given up to keep it alive. Maybe they'd apologize, acknowledge the pain they had caused by choosing Ethan over me. But there was none of that. Their acceptance was almost worse than if they had argued. The day I packed up my office was surreal. For over a decade, that space had been my sanctuary, the place where I solved problems, brainstormed ideas, and planned for the future. Now it felt empty, stripped of meaning. I moved through it like a ghost, boxing up reminders of a life that already felt distant. As I carried the last of my things out to my car, I glanced back at the building one final time. The bakery had been my whole world for so long, the center of everything I thought I wanted. But now, as I stood there in the parking lot, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I didn't feel sad. I felt free. Leaving wasn't easy, though. In the days that followed, I felt a sense of loss, so profound it was almost physical. The bakery had been more than a job. It had been my identity. Without it, I didn't know who I was or what I was supposed to do next. I spent the first week in a daze, wandering around my apartment, unsure of how to fill the hours that had once been consumed by work. Every morning, I woke up expecting to check emails, call suppliers, or review sales reports, only to be met with silence. The stillness was deafening, a constant reminder of everything I had walked away from. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to shift. For the first time in years, I had space to think, to breathe. I started reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in far too long, people I had pushed away in my endless pursuit of success. They welcomed me back with open arms, as if no time had passed, and their kindness reminded me of what I had been missing. I also started taking care of myself in ways I hadn't before. I went hiking in the mornings, letting the crisp air clear my head. I read books that had been sitting on my shelf for years, their spines uncracked. I even signed up for a pottery class, something I had always wanted to try, but had never made time for. Slowly, I began to rediscover pieces of myself that had been buried under the weight of responsibility and obligation. The bakery had consumed so much of my life that I hadn't realized how many other opportunities were out there. As word spread about my departure, I started receiving calls from old contacts, people I had worked with over the years, suppliers, consultants, even former employees. They reached out with words of encouragement, offers of support, and, in some cases, job opportunities. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with these offers. Starting over felt daunting, almost impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how liberating it was to have a blank slate. For the first time in years, I wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations or vision. I could build something new, something that was entirely my own. Meanwhile, I started hearing rumblings about the bakery. Ethan's flashy initiatives were beginning to backfire. The marketing campaigns he had poured so much money into weren't delivering results, and his aggressive expansion plans were straining resources. Longtime customers were starting to voice their dissatisfaction, frustrated by the changes that had stripped the bakery of its warmth and charm. It wasn't just the customers either. Employees were leaving in droves, tired of the chaotic leadership and lack of direction. The company I had worked so hard to build was unraveling, piece by piece. When I heard the news, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to say, "I told you so." But mostly I just felt sad. The bakery had been a part of my family for so long, and now it was slipping away, caught in a spiral of mismanagement and hubris. My parents never mentioned the struggles. When we spoke, our conversation stayed polite and surface level, carefully avoiding the topic of the bakery. The distance between us had grown, a chasm that neither side seemed willing to bridge. Eventually, I stopped waiting for an apology or acknowledgement. I realized that holding on to that hope was only keeping me tethered to the past. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant freeing myself to move forward. Months after leaving, I found myself standing in front of an empty storefront, the for lease sign glinting in the sunlight. I had been driving past it for weeks, unable to shake the feeling that it was calling to me. Starting over felt terrifying, but it also felt right. I didn't know exactly what kind of business I wanted to open or what it would look like, but I knew one thing. It would be mine. Looking back now, I see the bakery for what it was, a chapter in my life, not the whole story. For years, I thought my value was tied to what I could do for others, to how much I could sacrifice for my family. But leaving showed me something I hadn't seen before. My worth isn't determined by anyone else's approval. Walking away wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something new. And for the first time in years, I feel ready to write it.